Welcome to the Special Needs Kids Are People Too podcast with Amy Bodkin, EDS. Amy is an autistic adult who also happens to be a school psychologist turned special needs consultant and public speaker. She's also a homeschooling mom to 2 autistic kiddos, a yoga instructor, a card-carrying Trekkie, and an all-around fun person. And last but not least, Amy is an advocate for seeing every child as a person, not a diagnosis. Because a special needs kid is just like any other child, just more so. Here's Amy Bodkin.
Hi, I'm Amy Bodkin, coming to you from the blanket fort in my office, and welcome to Special Needs Kids Are People Too. I thought today we would spend a little bit of time talking, I would spend a little time talking about what my experiences were like growing up being autistic. Of course, with each person, it's totally different, so my experiences aren't necessarily going to mirror every other person that's autistic's experiences. But it might give you a little bit of an insight into how our behavior is... Sometimes our behavior is defined on assessments and tests as being weird or unusual behavior. And really, our behavior isn't all that weird or unusual if you understand how to read the behavior. So I mentioned my blanket fort in my office. One of the things that I loved as a kid was crawling under tables or chairs or in small dark places because it felt more safe, more secure. There were fewer sensory inputs kind of coming right at you, overwhelming the senses. So that was kind of a big thing, and it probably looked weird to a lot of people, but that's why I was doing it. So, the next thing, or the first thing people probably noticed about my development, and actually most people didn't notice this, only my parents noticed this, and I don't think that they found it to be all that unusual at the time. But one of the things that's really popular when we're small is smearing. I like to call it brown finger painting. So that's definitely something that we tend to do. There's a very famous psychologist, a little bit infamous, Freud. You've probably heard of him. He had a series of stages of development, and he had birth to 18 months was the oral stage. Everything goes in the mouth. And 18 months to 3 to 4 years was called the anal stage, meaning it was like toilet training and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of things about Freud that I don't really appreciate, but he's not wrong. We kind of do tend to put everything in our mouths when we're small and want to explore our bodies and figure out, oh, what's this? So, another thing that I don't think they thought too much of it at the time was I had delayed speech. In my case, and also my daughter's case, she gave me permission to share some of this as well. We're just both highly visual, and so we tend to think with our eyes and with pictures and not so much words. So words weren't really important to us, which also led to some other issues when it came to pronouns and gender and race too, because we were kind of trying to just get the basics down. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what's a ball? What's a cup? What's a person? And I was really much more concerned with the big idea than the little ways to distinguish between subtypes. I really didn't care about the subtypes. So for a very long time, I kept asking my parents, am I a girl or am I a boy? And I just couldn't figure it out. And honestly, to me, it doesn't really seem to be all that important. At least not until you get older to being an adult. Why would I care if you're a boy or a girl? I can still play with boys just as well as I can play with boys as a small child. So I didn't really see that there was really anything necessary to know there. And also it applied to race. So my father is rather pale, tall and pale. And one time I was looking for him, and I ran up and hugged this really tall guy. But he was not pale. He was very dark. And I thought he was my dad at first. And I didn't tend to see gender and color or appearance differences as much. It was and it was also less the face, less focusing on the face itself, where a lot of those differences exist, and more just, okay, got it. Person's there, and that's good. Let's see, what were some other things I did as a kid? A lot of autistic kids, we cause our parents a great deal of stress sometimes, because we have a tendency to, I'm going to call it, for the purposes of this podcast, since it's a family podcast, self-stimulate. And a lot of the reason that we tend to do that is because it releases endorphins that tend to calm the anxiety that we often feel. And we do that as small kids a lot. It's not unusual. And it's really rather kind of a smart way of handling anxiety that you can do nothing about. Sleep troubles, oh, that was a problem, even from when I was a baby. My mom had to take away the sheets that had little animals printed on them and use just plain white sheets with me, because even as a baby, I would trace the little animals on the sheets with my finger instead of going to sleep. And another thing from the crib, with the brown finger painting, or so one time my dad came into my room. I was supposed to be taking a nap, and he heard something, and it sounded kind of like some kind of noise, and he couldn't quite figure it out, so he peeks in. And I have been reaching into my diaper and pulling things out of it and throwing them around the room. And he was not thrilled. So that happens sometimes. It happens sometimes with typical kids, but it happens a little bit more sometimes when you stay in that stage longer. And really, honestly, that's what a lot of this stuff is all about. We stay in stages a lot longer than anybody else. So we spend a lot more time exploring different things, making connections with how different sorts of sensory inputs feel, and things like that. So, when you're a baby, you kind of see those differences in like eating, sleeping, and pooping, because that's what babies do. And so we've covered a lot of those kinds of things, and then also how you're relating to those around you. I did have a little bit of trouble with transitioning to food versus just nursing. And that's not unusual, but nothing huge there. I had much more trouble with sleep and sensory type things and anxiety. Let's see. So then I guess next was toddler, preschooler years. And that's where my great aunt figured out, okay, something's going on with this kid. She worked as a teacher, and so she sent my mom a handout basically trying to say, hello, your child needs some extra help. And my mom, I was there first, so she was like, I don't see what you're talking about. Now, once I started 4-year-old kindergarten, it became obvious pretty quick. I started having trouble in school from the get-go, learning colors, learning letters, learning sounds, learning to read. My favorite story actually is when I was in kindergarten. In kindergarten, where I went to school, you wrote on 100 pages your numbers 1 to 100. And then when you got done with that, you went on to 101 to 200, and then from 201 to 300, and so forth. And for each 100 page you finished, you got a badge, a number badge. And some of the kids would get up to 2, 3, 4,000 in the year. Well, I didn't quite figure that out. And so I kept writing 1 to 100 over and over and over again throughout the entire year and got one badge. But what's really funny, though, is that these days, with what I do for special needs consultations with the Charlotte Mason Plenary, I do a lot of assessments. And the assessments, when you're scoring them, it involves a lot of counting and usually not higher than 100. So in a way, I guess you could say I was kind of preparing for what I would do when I grew up. But there were a lot of learning problems. They had someone test me when I was 6 and found several processing issues. By the time I was 7, I was seeing a psychiatrist, psychologist, getting an EEG done, all the bells and whistles. And what, at the time, I ended up diagnosed with ADHD. I didn't get the diagnosis, well, I don't know that it's changed, but they added the autism diagnosis when I was an adult. So we're going to get to that in another episode. I wanted to kind of focus on some of those childhood experiences and things this time. So growing up, I was diagnosed with ADHD only. And I was on Ritalin, and I was on usually the highest dose in the school. At least that's what I understood from comparing doses with other kids. And it was a significant issue. And it really didn't totally fix the issue. And I really didn't like myself on that medication. As an adult now, having a more complete picture of kind of what was going on, I have come to realize that it probably increased my anxiety a little bit because it's a stimulant, so it's going to kind of ramp your body up, which probably was the opposite of what I needed with the whole autism component. But they didn't really know that at the time. And this was before the days of the internet, because I'm an old autistic. The average lifespan for an autistic adult is 36 years old. And the reason is because in early childhood, there's a lot of accidental death within our population. And then as you get older into your teen years, there's a greater risk of mental health issues because too many times autistics are having to mask and pretend to be like everybody else instead of getting to be themselves. And that causes a lot of mental health issues. And then once you finally make it to adulthood, if you've been doing all of that masking and pretending to be like everybody else and not being yourself, then you've probably caused yourself enough anxiety and stress that you've ended up with autoimmune conditions and all kinds of inflammatory diseases. So our average lifespan tends to be a lot shorter for those reasons. Not that all autistics only make it until 36. I'm doing fine, thank you very much. But we do tend to have a shorter lifespan just because of those averages and those risk factors. And so it's really, really, really important to focus on mental health more so than trying to catch up to normal or look normal or any of those kinds of things. That's not really all that important. You need to learn to be the best you that you can be, because there's only one you in this world. And if you're not being you, then the world is missing out on something special. So, Mr. Rogers is, by the way, one of my favorite TV shows, period. And I really like the message he spread about, there's only one person in this whole world like you, and that you are special just the way you are. I actually made my kids watch Mr. Rogers for part of their school, so every day they'd have to watch an episode of Mr. Rogers. I called it their social skills training. which I thought was the best social skills training in the world, because so many times we do social skills training and we're saying, oh, well, you should look someone in the eye and you should do this and you should do that. And Mr. Rogers is focusing more on building a relationship with children and helping them recognize that they're not the only person in the world who's lost, a pet or who's felt the way that they feel, and that who they are is really special and unique and important. So Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood is nice, but it doesn't give the same message because it's a child talking to another child. It's not an adult talking to a child and developing that relationship that so many kids who watched Mr. Rogers were missing in their life. So, little side trip there. Mr. Rogers was definitely a favorite. I also really loved Sesame Street, and I'm still a huge Sesame Street fan. A little less so in recent years. I kind of like old school better. There's been a lot of controversy over the Julia character. It's great when people want to put an autistic character in a kid's show, especially when it's a learning opportunity. But Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood has made a point of trying to listen very carefully to the autistic adult community, which I think is really important, because if you want to know how we feel and how we see things, you should ask us, because we know ourselves better than anybody else. We might not be capable of communicating that very well for a while, but as we get older, we get better at it. There are things about my childhood, things that I didn't understand how I felt, that I could explain to people 20 years later. By that time, it wasn't terribly useful, but, it helps to learn to understand yourself better, and making sure you slow down and take that time to listen to yourself, your body, your mind, and to learn to listen to that and not have to change anything or do anything. It really helps with learning to kind of create more body awareness and more integration, whereas usually we go the opposite way and we're so anxious that we live all in our head and we're completely disconnected from our body and spirit or soul, whichever way you like to look at it. So lots and lots of learning problems, medication. And again, this was before the days of the internet. And I really firmly believe that if you have a parent who loves their child and is trying to do their best, then you've got a really great situation. There are a lot of cases where people don't have parents who love them and who work hard to try to do the best they can. So I think it's important to recognize that. And it's not like as parents we get some kind of a manual of how to raise this child. What's going to work? What's not going to work? So in general, parents are doing the best they can, and they're also working through their own challenges that they're having to grow through as well. So if you love your child and you keep trying to do the work of growing as a person yourself and trying to do the best you can by your child, then I feel like you're doing a pretty good job. And I felt like my parents did a pretty good job. There were several things they did really well. We did lots of games when I was a kid, trying to help me learn all of my math facts. Was not very good at that. And also sight word cards. So somehow I missed that the whole point was to learn the math facts and the words. So I memorized the cards. So, okay, this is the card that has a slight bend in the upper right-hand corner. That's the word and. So I completely missed the point, and it took a lot longer that way. I'm trying to think of other things that we did. My dad always coached all of my ball games when I was in elementary school, which was great because it tended to help me out a little bit socially. I was not the most natural when it came to people. I frequently would put my foot in my mouth. or do something that was really weird and not realize it was really weird. Or at least that's how people saw it anyways, I think. But that really helped. And then they were very involved with my school. And my school, it was a small private school. This was back in the early days of special education. So there was very little available at the public schools anyways. And I went to this little, small, private Christian school. And the education was kind of geared from like the 1950s. Like I really did learn to read on Dick and Jane. And so in some ways it wasn't a great fit, at least as far as the education was designed. But I did have a lot of teachers who, like my parents, were very caring people who loved me and wanted to try to help me. Some of the things they tried didn't always work the best. Because of my inattention, I would have a list taped to my desk. At one point, my desk was right next to the teacher's, and I kind of found it pretty embarrassing, but on the other hand, they were having trouble getting me to pay attention in class, and they really didn't know what they were doing because, I mean, this was back in the very early days of public school special education. We didn't have that until the mid to late 70s, and I was born in the early 80s, so it was all relatively new, and we've learned so much since that time, especially as some of these children have grown up and become adults and been able to talk about their experiences. That's just not something that we had before. Either you found a way to make it through school without special education, or a lot of times you ended up in an institution. If you were very lucky, then your parents would keep you home and work with you. But the world before that was very different. So, it may not be perfect now, but we do have a lot to be thankful for. Along with friend problems came issues with humor. I still have issues with this. I'm married to somebody who loves sarcasm, and I frequently miss it. My children have been exposed to it much earlier than I was, and so they have learned to hear a lot of it. There's still types of humor they don't get, but my level of humor, I'm really good at bathroom humor. Beyond that, it's a little more challenging. And then a lot of times I'd end up kind of oblivious to what was going on around me, looking very distracted. Sometimes ADHD symptoms come about due to anxiety, and sometimes you also have ADHD too. And sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference. Sensory issues, that was huge. Oh, junior high was a nightmare. So every day I would go to school and be at school all day long, and it would be too cold or too hot or too loud and too many places to get to and no breaks, and it was very stressful. And then my hormones were changing and everybody else's hormones were changing, and they were trying to figure out who they are and how to behave, and I was trying to figure out who I was and how to behave, and then I was trying to figure out what in the world they were doing. And it just ended up being a nightmare. Every single day that I would come home from school in junior high, I would end up screaming and yelling because I had just had it. My mom eventually figured out that if she would tell me to get on the computer as soon as I got home, because this was in the early days of the internet, which was super exciting, but also kind of the wild, wild west of the internet, because nobody thought of the internet as dangerous at that time. And kids were getting in chat rooms all the time and nobody was concerned about it. But if she would tell me to get on the computer when I got home, then I could be in a space where I'm controlling everything. The sound, what I'm doing, what I'm interacting with. And I could zone in on that and block everything else out. And so I was able to decompress that way after school, and then I could start in on homework and those kinds of things. All of those big developmental stages were kind of difficult. Learning to drive, that one was interesting. I can't tell you how many times I ended up on the wrong side of the road in Memphis. The first day that I was driving by myself, I pulled out of the road onto the busiest road in Memphis and was going in the wrong direction at rush hour. Thankfully, there was a stoplight, so I was able to kind of swerve into the right lane before oncoming traffic came. But I had all sorts of little incidences when I drove. When I was first learning how to drive, I drove over multiple medians because, again, I was on the wrong side of the road. It was quite an interesting learning curve. Most things I eventually got there, it just took me longer. And my mother liked to always say that that adulthood was kind of like the great equalizer, because everybody else finally stopped advancing so much, and I was able to kind of go, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. All right. And I don't know, my development seemed to kind of, catch up in a way. I wasn't really too worried about, I guess, catching up. Well, I tried it for a little while. That was a disaster. Trying to do what everybody else is doing and be where everybody else is when your brain's not ready for that is never a good idea. I did learn some really helpful tips while I was in college, mostly by trial and error. I color-coded all of my books, spirals, and everything by subject. So that way, if I needed to go somewhere, all I had to do was grab the right color. And I did really well with color-coding things. And I don't think I did that in high school, but I figured that out by college. And a lot of this was me figuring things out as I went, because there really wasn't a whole lot at the time. And I had the wrong diagnosis on top of it. Well, at least I was missing an important one. And with girls, it's different from boys too. And a lot of girls go undiagnosed because, well, other little girls love to be little mothers, and so they kind of help us along. Well, bless her heart. She just hadn't quite got it together yet. Let me help her along. And by the way, for those of you guys not in the southeastern United States, bless your heart does not mean, wow, you're an idiot. Bless your heart means, you poor thing. I'm going to help you and give you a leg up because you're just not there yet. So it's not always really a jab at people. But yeah, so I learned a lot of things, trial and error, same way my parents did too, because it was the early days of ADHD, kind of, at least as far as Ritalin went and all the popularity of it. And it was the early days of special education and prior to the internet for a good part of that. The other thing, I did a lot of repetitive noises. And sometimes I think it would appear like echolalia, where you repeat phrases, that kind of thing. And I have been known to bang my head as well. And for me, that's all about blocking out this internal, kind of like a monologue, sort of, but it's really not a monologue. It's more like a video that replays all of those times that I thought, wow, that was so stupid of you. Why did you do that? And I felt really bad about that particular thing. It's probably something that nobody else remembers. But for some reason, it got stuck on that tape in my head. And when it replays, then it drives me crazy. And the only way to block it out is to repeat things in my head or talk to myself or bang my head or something like that. And a lot of that, it goes with anxiety, because autism and anxiety, they're kind of linked a lot. Because when your sensory processing stuff isn't coming in right, it's kind of anxiety provoking at the very least. And then when people want you to try to be like everybody else, that's even more anxiety provoking. And then when you're trying to do something and you need to access something, but you can't figure out how to do it correctly, and you can tell you're screwing it up, but you don't know how or why, that can also be upsetting. I have definitely had a strong preference for sameness. I could eat mac and cheese for an entire week and be perfectly happy. I could watch the same movie over and over and over again and be perfectly happy, and frequently do, by the way. Drives my husband crazy. He only likes to watch movies once and then he's good. But a lot of that comes down to things to support anxiety. Sameness is routine. It's stability. It helps keep you from feeling as anxious. And I think the last thing I wanted to touch on and mention today is temper tantrums, or actually what we would call meltdowns. Meltdowns are not the same as temper tantrums. Meltdowns come from extreme frustration. And when I was a child, I thought I had a terrible temper because I was always... Basically, it looked like I was throwing temper tantrums. I know now they were meltdowns. And when... I have 4 younger brothers and sisters, so I was constantly on sensory overload. And I didn't realize it until I no longer lived with my brothers and sisters. And then suddenly I realized, wow, I'm not angry and having a temper tantrum anymore. And turns out they were meltdowns. And so when I wasn't on sensory overload, I did much better. But I didn't know I was on sensory overload because I was the oldest, and I didn't remember not having younger brothers and sisters and the sensory overload of all the people and activities and things that we'd go do. And it created a lot of stress and anxiety. Personally, I love having younger brothers and sisters. I often say that my 3 favorite things I've ever been are a mom, an aunt, and a big sister. I always loved having somebody else to love, and having the honor of getting to be someone who got to take care of someone else. I thought that was a real privilege to be given that kind of responsibility. And I always appreciated the relationship. But sensory overload was a huge issue. And when your sensory pathways are not sending the same messages that everybody else's are, it can be very overloading. And I like to describe it as living in that one moment in the Indiana Jones movie, the one where he has to take that leap of faith, and it looks like he's stepping into a great chasm, but turns out there's a bridge there. He just can't see it because it's blended into the background. And even though it's terrifying, he has to take that step. And when he does, he realizes that there's a bridge. And so I like to say that being autistic and having sensory processing issues is a lot like living every moment of your life in that one moment of the Indiana Jones movie. And it can obviously be overwhelming. It can lead to a lot of frustration, meltdowns, fear, anxiety. Chronic anxiety can then lead to all sorts of health issues, not to mention food issues. Because as your body goes into fight or flight, it releases all of the vitamins, minerals, neurotransmitters, hormones, amino acids, etc. into the bloodstream, then pees them out. And you do that over and over again, you end up with imbalances in the immune system, which can create allergies, turn on latent genes, cause autoimmune conditions. And we'll talk more about that in a future episode, because I really think that's something that's super important to pay attention to. Because if we can learn to be ourselves and learn to be happy being ourselves and to find a sense of peace and to not constantly be in fight or flight, then we can do almost anything. Because that's the hardest thing. If you can do that, it just opens up so many possibilities for you, because anxiety can be such a killer of joy, of learning, of anything. And I guess that's kind of the one thing I learned from all of the many different symptoms that I had over the course of my childhood. It took me a long time to get there. I didn't figure it out until I was in my 30s. I went through college, graduate school, started experiencing health problems in graduate school because I was pushing myself so hard because I wanted to show everybody I could do it because I felt like people thought I couldn't. I don't think they necessarily thought that always, but that's how I felt about it. And so I worked really hard. I learned a lot of things, but what I ended up learning after that was that there's nothing more important than taking care of your mental health. And sometimes that means doing less. So join me next time where we're going to be talking about when I finally get my autism diagnosis and about becoming a mother and some of my favorite stories from the last 10 to 15 years.
We hope you had fun listening to today's episode and gained some new insights into the wonderful variety of people in our world. You can find out more about Amy's advocacy work at amybodkin.com. And remember, special needs kids are people too.